Hey guys, in this video we will start designing our first form using PHP and Bootstrap and HTML and all of these wonderful things that come together to allow us to collect data from users and leading towards storing it for later use. So we already started designing our site. We created our folder structure, put in our files and our references, and we kind of segmented our code to have that kind of layout, look and feel. So now what we're going to do is start modifying our index page to be a form that collects data, and we look at using the get submission for our form. Now I'm just going to start modifying the content of the page, and I'm going to, instead of printing hello world, I'm going to say registration for conference. So we're creating an IT conference registration form where we want all of the would-be attendees to start putting in their information and declaring, oh, you know, I'm a DBA, so at least we get an idea of who is going to attend our conference, and we can store it up for analytics later on. All right, so I have this H1 tag as the first thing on the page, and it's always good to have an H1 tag, not only for readability by the user to know where they are, but also for search engines. They love H1 tags on pages, and you get higher rankings for these kind of things. I also want this H1 tag to be in the center of my page. So if I take a look at what happens here, I just refresh. Now I have it saying registration for IT conference. So instead of just saying that, I'm going to, or instead of having it to the left, I'm going to center align it. So Bootstrap has a class, and you can always go and look at the documentation for yourself. I've been using it for a while, so it has kind of become a part of me, but always feel free to go back to the Bootstrap website, look at the documentation if it is that you're not sure how to accomplish something. So I'm going to center align it, and while I'm here, I'll just try and find that reference in the documentation. All right, so if we go under utilities and look for text, then the first thing that you see is text alignment. So if it is that you want to move your text around, whether to the left, to the center, to the right, or, you know, they have different ones, then they give you the code examples. So you can use a class text left to push it to the left, text center to push it to the center, etc., etc. So it's really simple. Once you catch on, you'll remember them quickly. So I want to center align, so I'm just going to say text center. Another thing that I want to point out is that even though the example may have been with a P tag, it applies to anything that is text. So it's a P tag example, yes, and we're using it on an H1 tag. It can be used on almost any tag that has to do with text. The fact is, it will take any content of that and center align it or align it accordingly. All right, so you don't have to worry about the example versus the type of tag you're using. And what I did, I just highlighted this and used Shift Tab to push everything back to the left column. I'm just a stickler for indentation. So next, we're going to do a form. So to do a form, we have a tag in HTML called form. And I'm just going to open and close this quickly, as forms can have quite a few things and you don't want to forget to close your tag, because that can lead to some annoying and irritating debugging issues. Now, to design my form using Bootstrap classes, I'm just going to quickly jump over to the documentation and find, and I think that would be in components, find references for forms. There we go. So they give us some sample forms. They say, you know, if you use my classes, this is what your form can look like with relative ease. All right, and they tell you the different controls that you have, and you can style and the sizing. So you have quite a few options if you go through, and you can get quite a bit of inspiration for a form layout or design from their examples. For today, however, we're going to keep it simple. So I'm just going to go back up to the first example that was there, where we have the label, what it is you want, and the specific control for it up to the submit button. So I can actually just take a look at this code and see how it's done. I'm actually just going to copy this code, go back to my site and replace the form tags that I just so carefully put in, and I'm going to replace them with all of that code. And I'm just going to spend a few moments here and get all of my indentation proper so that I know where everything starts and stops. All right, so I have my form tag opening and closing here. And then you notice that there are a bunch of divs in between. All right, and then if you look inside of the divs, you have the label, which is the word that is printed saying, this is what I'm prompting for. So this one was the prompt for the email address. And then we have the input type. And in HTML5, you have quite a few types available to you. In this case, the type is email, so it actually runs specific validations on the email address to make sure that you're putting in an email address out of the box without any additional code, and some other attributes. And then they give you a small, where they give you a tip. So if you just look at the code versus the example, then you kind of see where everything is. So we have email address, and that was in the label section. You have the text box, and that one has in a placeholder that says enter email. So that's an attributes placeholder that gives you that kind of grayed out text that disappears when text actually goes in. And then under here, you see that there's a little tag here that says we'll never share, and they show you the code to get all of that. So the fact is, you copied it, you may not need it, you can remove and just reform as needs be. Now I just added a few comments here, or one big comment here with the different fields that we intend to collect from our would-be attendees. All right, so we want to call it the first name, last name, the date of birth, and we'll be using a date picker. We'll take their specialty, and these are the specialties that we're catering for, and I'll just add other just in case. All right, and then we want the email address and a contact number, and that is what our form should be designed to collect from our users. All right, so now we'll start butchering, or start modifying. Let me not say butchering. We'll start customizing this code so that we can accomplish our mission. Now I'm giving you a template. Be as creative as you need to be. If you want to try something else, that's fine. If you run into a difficulty, always feel free to reach out to me. Now, there are certain things about this code that I'm going to retain, because that is just how Bootstrap allows us to take advantage of its design. So for instance, you notice that you always have a div class called form group, and inside this div, then you have whatever else goes into that form group, meaning the input type and the label for it and anything else. So each one of these would get its own div with class form group. So I already have email address, so I'm not going to delete the email address, but what I'm going to do is copy this form group, and I'm going to create another one. All right, and then I'm going to modify this other one. So I have email address here already. I'm not removing email address, but email address is not the first thing on the list. It's like the second to last. I still have at least 4 other things above it. So I'm going to keep on putting things above the email address until I get there. So I'm going to change the label firstly, and you want to change the label for and the ID, because what happens is that in HTML5, they give you that label for and ID thing. Well, really Bootstrap, because when you click the label, it kind of highlights the control without you clicking the control itself. So watch as I click the word password, this highlights. So you want that label for and the ID to match to get that kind of effect. And you don't want to repeat the IDs. You never want to repeat the IDs of your elements throughout your website. So I'm going to change this one to something more meaningful, because I'm doing first name. And I spelled first wrongly, so you want to make sure you get all the spellings correctly. And so that's the ID. I'm going to change the label for attribute to first name. I'm going to change the label's text from email address to first name. And I'm going to change anything here that had to do with email. I'm basically going to change it out relative to it being used for a first name. So the input type here is email. First name is not an email. It would be more text. And I'm going to change this email help to say first name. Actually, I don't think I need this. This attribute is not absolutely necessary. So I'm just going to remove that one. I don't need that one. All right. And I'm going to remove this small text. All right. I don't need that. So pretty much if you just want a label and a text box, this is what it's going to look like. You have your div with class form-group, and then you have your label, and then you have your input. And I'm going to change the placeholder text to say enter first name. And really and truly, I don't need placeholder text if I have a label. So once again, it's up to you and your design. All right. I don't like seeing a placeholder when I already have the label. So I'm going to remove that one. So this is what it looks like if I want a label and a text box. And this is for the first name. Now, to call it the last name would be pretty much identical. So I'm just going to copy and paste this and change everything out to be relative to last name. All right. So now I'm collecting for last name. I changed the label text. I changed the for attribute value and the ID of the text box so that they work together. And now I'm collecting for last name. Next, we want date of birth. So date of birth, I'm just going to continue along the same line. And the for is going to be, and I'm just going to write DOB for short. The ID here is DOB, date of birth. The label text says date of birth, birth with an I. And then the type can be actually date picker because HTML5 actually has, well, date. Sorry. So the data type, the input type date actually gives us a date picker. And we're going to look into if this is the best way to do it or not. But for now, that can work. All right. Next, we need another control because we have specialty, which is going to be more like a drop-down box, allowing us to select. So if I use a drop-down, obviously you can only select one of the above. We could use a radio button. And if we use a checkbox, then it would be to allow us to select all, at least one or all of the potential values. So that's up to you and your conference. For my conference, I believe that your specialty is only one, so I'm going to give you a drop-down box. All right. So I'm just going to copy this once again. And I'm copying and pasting just to spare myself retyping things that I don't have to retype, right? So this one, the label is specialty. And I'm going to say specialty or area of expertise. So I can always make my labels as wordy or not as I want. That's the text that is being printed to the user. I'm going to change the ID. Well, I'm going to change this whole control because a drop-down box wouldn't be invoked using an input tag. So I'm going to just go over to Bootstrap and see what they have for me in terms of drop-down boxes. And they actually have it. They have the form controls section where they're showing me a drop-down list. And that's what it looks like once Bootstrap is applied. All right. And the example for it is right here. We have the form group. So that's basically a constant. They have the label. And then what we have is a select tag with options in between. So I'm just going to copy this out because we have everything else. All right. We have everything else in place. I'm just going to copy out that select section and then spend some time fixing our indentation here. And then I'm going to leave this class. So you notice all of them have that class form-control, right? So without the form-control, they wouldn't look as dynamic as they do here. They don't have that Bootstrap look and feel. And we'll look at that later. So I'm going to I have my select tag. I'm going to change the ID here to specialty, right? So that the label knows to work with it. And then I'm going to put in my options. And my options, once again, were database admin. So database admin, software developer, and web administrator and other. So I'll just type those in quickly. All right, and now that is done. So we have our drop down list, and no, we haven't been looking at it. I don't know if you have been, and that's good if you have been. I haven't. So we're just building blindly and hoping that everything snaps together as we would like it, and if it doesn't, we'll just fix it as we go along. So now we're at the email address, and once again, because we took that example, we already have email address. I'm just going to shore it up or change it up a bit because it's a bit too wordy for me. So label for email, and the controls ID is now going to be email so that these two know to work together. And I'll just leave everything else here. And this would actually be a nice little disclaimer. We'll never share your email with anyone else because you register for my conference. I'm not going to use your email maliciously. You know, you could use this little tip, right? And oh, so this ID and this attribute go hand in hand. See that? So I did remove it from previous times, but here is why Bootstrap would have kind of put that there. All right. So you can experiment with that. The next thing that we want after email is the contact number. And I'm actually just going to retain the email code, and I'm going to reuse it for phone number because, well, I'm going to show you why. So phone. So the label for is phone. The forms, the controls ID is phone, and then the label is going to say, well, contact number. All right. I believe that there is, I'm going to use text. So there are ways to make the text box look like it's supposed to collect a phone number, but we're not there yet. So I'm just going to use text, and I'm going to remove the placeholder, and I'm going to do the same for the placeholder above. Once again, I don't like having both the label and the placeholder. I think they should be used interchangeably. That's personal though. And I'm going to leave this help text, and I'm going to say phone help instead of email help. And the same here. And then I'm going to leave this help text, and I'll say we'll never share your number with anyone else. So we have two privacy disclaimers here that we're going to maintain the privacy of your phone number and your email address. All right, now that we're finished with our form, because we have everything that we require, we can just clean up the rest of the code. So I think part of the example that we took also had this text box for password, which we don't need, at least not yet, and this checkbox for an example also. So we can remove that. And we have a button, which is of type submit, which invokes a submission attempt to the browser. And we have class equals btn-primary, which gives us a nice blue button, and the submit form. All right. So you could always customize this. You could change this to a green button by saying btn-success and say register. It's up to you. Personalize it as you wish. But for now, we're going to go ahead and preview our page. So this is where we left off, and let us see where we are now. And look at that. That is lovely. All right. So we have our H1 tag, nicely center aligned. We have our first name, and notice when I click just the label, each control kind of lights up. Once again, that was the label for and the ID at work. And then that is what our form looks like. We just built a form, and all we did was do it the way Bootstrap did, and look at the beautiful outcome. All right. Now, I'm just going to play around a bit and show you other things that we could do. Firstly, if I take out the form control class reference, let me show you what happens. Then our text box looks like this, which is just the standard and default. So that is why we have in that form control class, so that it takes on the Bootstrap attributes. So I'm just going to reintroduce that. If I wanted my button to not be so small, all right, it's kind of lost all the way down there, then I have a class btn-block, and btn-block makes the button stretch right across the page. All right. And I want some space between my submit and my copyright. So I can probably put in a few BR tags. So I'm just going to put in about 4 or 5. And then you notice that you have that space. So we can go back and fix the footer later. But just to show you that whatever content you put in the index page between the header includes and our footer includes, it will render that way. All right. And then if we look up here in our title, we see attendance dash index. And remember that we're setting that value in this top section of the site, and header is just making reference to it. Now, one more thing I want us to look at is our date control. So we had used for date of birth, the date data type. All right. And then if you just take a quick glance at it, you actually see where it looks different from the regular text box. And if we try to change these values, we see that we're confined or restricted to only put in date related values. Other text can't go in there, and that's perfect. The danger, however, is that this date control is going to get rendered differently relative to the browser being used. So in this situation, our Chrome browser is going to give us a nice control, calendar control, and we can just select the date. However, in my Edge Explorer, when I click this, I'm getting a different type of control. All right. Now, they both work, so it's not a matter of functionality. However, they work differently, and I can see where this is going to lead to user experience issues or even support issues, because if you are used to seeing your website in Chrome and somebody calls in saying it's not working properly in Edge, then that's a design issue as far as I'm concerned. So we want consistency across our website and in all browsers. Now, what we need to do to maintain consistency across all browsers with our date picker or date control is to actually reference a date picker. And one of the more popular and easy to use ones would be from JQueryUI. So I'm just going to Google JQueryUI and we'll just go to the website. And here they have a bunch of what you call widgets. You can get accordion controls, autocomplete, all sorts of things. So the one that we're interested in is the date picker. So we'll just look at how we go about including that. And they give us a quick example where you click and you get a date picker control. No matter what the browser, this is how it's going to look. And that is what we want. So we just click view source, and then they show us kind of what needs to be included, right? So we need a style sheet, and they actually give us some CDN links. So we need a style sheet and we need 2 script files. We need a reference to jQuery and then we need a reference to jQueryUI. Now, what happened is that when we took the example from Bootstrap, in our footer, one of the scripts being referenced is jQuery. So we don't need to include the jQuery again. What we just need to do now is reference the jQueryUI section. So I can just copy this and go back to my footer code and paste it, and I'll just paste it as the last thing. So once again, order matters. We need to make sure that we don't paste it above the original jQuery reference, because there are things in this that rely on code from this. So this has to be rendered first before this can start to work. Next, we can take this script example, this code block, where what it is doing is invoking a function and it is looking for some element with the ID date picker. So once you see the hashtag in JavaScript, it means it's looking for an element with ID, and then the ID it's looking for would be, in this case, date picker. So we're just going to take that and we're going to paste it underneath the reference to the jQuery code. So once again, order matters. I can't stress that enough. All right, so if you don't follow the order, then you're probably going to run into problems and referencing problems. And then I'm going to change this because we don't have any element with the ID date picker. What we want is to get our element called DOB. All right, so the element with ID DOB, that is where we want the date picker. So I'm just going to change this ID to DOB. So it will look for the element DOB once any page is loaded, and it will try to invoke the date picker class, which is a function, which is a function being called from this code, which has dependencies on stuff in this. So that is why the order matters once again. And then if we look into the rest of the example, we see here that the input type is text, not date. So we don't have to set it to date. It can be text. And the ID was date picker. So we already kind of established the fact that we need to change the ID. What I'm going to do now is change the type from date to text. So here it is, date, and I'm changing that to text, and I'll save. And one more thing that I didn't take over is the style sheet. All right. So this style sheet actually is what will make this look like this. All right. So we have to include that style sheet. So I'm just going to take that code, and that's a CDN link to the style sheet somewhere. And I'm going to go and paste it inside of the header, and I'll put it after the Bootstrap style sheet. So we have this Bootstrap style sheet, then we have the jQuery style sheet, and then we have our personal style sheet. All right, so when we refresh and try, we would notice that it is not working. All right, so when we want to debug when our like JavaScript and stuff is not working, we can always right click in the empty space and click inspect. And then that kind of brings up this debugging section where we can go to console and see what errors are being printed. And the error that is prevalent here is that it is saying that there's something that it is trying to access from the jQueryUI file that is not available. So remember, I was saying order matters. We have to make sure we reference the parent file, which is the jQuery file, before we reference the UI file, which we did, but it is saying that it cannot find certain things. And one of the errors here is saying that date picker is not a function, and it is referencing this jQuery file that we have already included. So what is happening here is a matter of versioning. So we have the latest jQuery, which is 3 point something, whereas if we look back at the example, we see that it is relying on jQuery version 1.12.4. So that is the root of our problem. So in other words, it is saying that you're trying to reference something that is not in the current version, and that's fine. So what we are going to do is just make sure that we reference this as the example would have indicated. So we're going to take this reference and we're going to go back to our code, and I'm going to put that reference right here above the jQuery reference. So this is our jQuery UI reference. I'm putting that one right above it. All right. So we have the latest version, which is jQuery 3.3.1, and that is being referenced first. And then this one is being referenced afterwards and just in time to load the jQuery UI. And then all of these references occurring allow date picker, or should allow date picker controller to work. So if I go back and I refresh, you notice that all of my console errors are gone. I have the website is not complaining about anything now. And then if I click in date of birth, I get my control. All right. And that is what we really wanted. So if I go back to Internet Explorer and refresh, then my control, my calendar looks the same way. And that is what we want, that level of consistency and accountability to our users. All right. And the great thing about this is that it doesn't allow any other keyboard input apart from maybe numbers, but they can't put text or very, very random things in there. So you can actually kind of prevent bad data from going into your application using these controls. All right. So that's it for setting up our form. And I hope you had fun. I hope you had learned something. And if you run into any difficulty, just let me know and I'll be sure to reach out to you.